Part 1. I hadn't planned on stopping. The snowstorm was just bad enough to make driving treacherous but not terrible enough to convince me to abandon my road trip. That changed when my phone chirped with an emergency alert, whiteout conditions expected. Avoid travel. My map app helpfully displayed a small, nondescript lodge less than 2 miles off the highway. By the time I pulled up, my tires were skidding on the ice-crusted driveway. The lodge was quaint, almost too picturesque, like something out of an old postcard. Strings of golden lights framed the eaves, their glow muted by falling snow. I killed the engine and stepped out, my boots crunching through the thick powder. The place seemed inviting enough, cozy light spilled from its frosted windows, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Yet, an uneasiness gnawed at me, like a splinter I couldn't find. Still, the storm wasn't letting up. I needed shelter. The sign above the door read, Snowbound Haven. I pushed through the heavy wooden door into a warm, cedar-scented lobby. A woman at the front desk glanced up and smiled. Her skin was as pale as the snow outside, and her smile was wide. Too wide. Welcome, she said, her voice honey-sweet. You're our only guest tonight. That shouldn't have been unnerving. It wasn't peak season, after all. But something about the way she said it, like it was both a promise and a warning, made my pulse quicken. We'll make sure your stay is unforgettable, she added, her gaze lingering a beat too long. As she handed me a key, I noticed something strange, a tiny smear of red on her wrist. Not blood, I told myself. Probably ink from a pen or lipstick. But her smile grew wider when she caught me staring. I'll show you to your room, she said, stepping out from behind the desk. The corridor was dimly lit and lined with faded portraits of what I assumed were the lodge's original owners. Every face seemed to be painted with precision, their eyes gleaming as if alive. One painting caught my attention, a woman who looked eerily similar to the receptionist, her painted grin just as unsettling. This used to be a private estate, the woman explained, her voice breaking the silence. Legend has it, the original owners never left. Even after their time ended. I gave a polite laugh, but my nerves were frayed. The feeling only intensified as she stopped in front of my room. You're in 13, she said, pushing open the door. A lucky number in some cultures. The room was charming in a rustic way, quilted bedspread, antique furniture, and a window overlooking the snowy woods. But as the receptionist stepped back into the hall, she paused. Don't hesitate to call if you need anything, she said. Anything at all. Her gaze flicked to the corner of the room, and her smile faltered for just a moment. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but enough to set my nerves aflame. Sleep well, she added, and the door clicked shut behind her. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My uneasiness only grew when I noticed something out of place. The antique wardrobe in the corner wasn't reflected in the mirror across from it. Instead, in the mirror's glass, the corner was empty. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, or rather, not seeing. I approached the mirror, my breath fogging the glass as I leaned in close. My reflection stared back, pale and uneasy, but the corner where the wardrobe stood remained stubbornly empty in the reflection. Maybe it was some trick of the glass, I reasoned. An old mirror like this could have all sorts of flaws. But when I turned back to the wardrobe, a chill prickled my skin. The faintest sound, like fabric brushing against wood, came from inside them. My logical brain told me it was nothing. Maybe the settling of the wood in the heat of the room. Still, I couldn't resist the gnawing urge to check. I crossed the room, my heart pounding, and hesitated with my hand on the ornate brass handle. The wardrobe door creaked open, revealing neatly hung clothes. My suitcase hadn't been there long enough for me to unpack, so these weren't mine. They looked old, faded dresses and jackets in styles I'd only ever seen in black and white movies that I pushed the hangers aside, searching for what could have caused the sound. Nothing. But then, as I moved to shut the door, I noticed something odd about the back panel. The wood didn't sit flush. It was slightly ajar, as if it were a hidden door. Curiosity and dread fought a brief war in my mind before curiosity won. I pressed on the panel, and it gave way, swinging inward to reveal a narrow, pitch-dark passage. A damp, cold air wafted out, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust, or blood. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffling, like bare feet on stone. My whole body went rigid as the sound grew closer, coming from the dark depths of the passage. Panic overrode reason, and I slammed the wardrobe shut, locking it with the tiny key hanging from its handle. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow. The silence in the room was deafening now. I glanced at the mirror again, and my stomach flipped. The wardrobe wasn't empty anymore. In the reflection, I could see the wardrobe door had opened slightly, and someone, was standing in the passage, half concealed in shadow. Their face was pale and hollow, their eyes staring directly at me. I whipped around to look at the wardrobe itself, but it was still closed and locked. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was the mirror lying? Or was the wardrobe hiding something far worse? A loud knock shattered the silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Everything all right in there? It was the receptionist's voice, muffled through the door. Why yeah, I stammered. Everything's fine. Good, she replied, but her tone was strange, almost mocking. Let us know if you see anything unusual. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, leaving me in the oppressive quiet once more. I wanted to leave, but the storm outside was now a howling beast, snow battering the windows. I was trapped. I decided to leave the wardrobe, and the mirror, alone. I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. Exhaustion eventually won out, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night, and I wasn't alone. The wardrobe was wide open, and the faint outline of a figure stood at the foot of my bed. I froze, unable to process the figure looming at the foot of my bed. The room was cloaked in darkness, but the outline was unmistakable, a person standing deathly still. My throat tightened, stifling any scream that might have escaped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the faint glow illuminating the room just enough to reveal nothing. The figure was gone. Had it ever been there? My racing heart suggested otherwise. Determined to get through the night, I left the bedside lamp on and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. Morning light filtered through the curtains, bringing a semblance of safety. I decided it was time to leave this place. As I packed, a knock echoed from the door. I hesitated before opening it to find the receptionist, her perpetual smile in place. Checking out early, she inquired, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Yes, I replied curtly, not offering any explanations. Safe travels, she said, handing me a receipt. Her eyes flicked to the mirror behind me, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move within its depths. I didn't wait to find out. Grabbing my bags, I hurried to my car. As I drove away, the lodge shrank in my rearview mirror, its quaint facade belying the terror within. I don't know what haunted that place, whether it was spirits, malevolent entities, or something beyond comprehension. But one thing is certain, I'll never seek shelter in a snowstorm again without knowing exactly what lies within. Part 2, when the holidays rolled around, I was the only one in my family who couldn't make the annual New Year's ski trip. Work had piled up, and I had a looming deadline I couldn't ignore. It didn't bother me at first. I figured I'd enjoy the peace and quiet of an empty house. They left the morning after Christmas, driving up to the mountains while the first whispers of a heavy snowfall began to blanket our little neighborhood. I stood in the driveway waving them off, watching as the car disappeared down the street and into the white haze. By evening, the snowstorm had escalated into a full-blown blizzard. The roads were buried, and the wind howled like a living thing, shaking the windows in their frames. I didn't mind, though. The house was warm, and the storm outside made my little cocoon feel even cozier. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered, plunging me into near darkness for a few seconds before humming back to life. I made a mental note to gather some candles and flashlights, just in case. The quiet was comforting at first. The muffled sounds of the storm outside were a white noise that lulled me into a sort of trance. I sipped hot chocolate, flipped through TV channels, and occasionally peeked out the window at the unbroken blanket of snow covering the yard. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. Just outside the living room window, leading from the side of the house and stopping about 10 feet from the door, was a trail of deep, heavy prints in the snow. They weren't spaced like someone walking casually, though. They were staggered, uneven, as if whoever made them had been limping. That I stared at them for a long moment, my breath fogging the glass. No one else was supposed to be home. My nearest neighbor lived half a mile away, and the thought of someone trekking through the storm just to wander onto my property sent a shiver down my spine. That I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it out the window. The footprints sparkled faintly in the beam of light, but there was no sign of the person who made them. Then I noticed something else. The trail didn't lead back toward the road or even around the house. It stopped, dead, in the middle of the yard, as if whoever it was had just vanished into thin air. The power flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. The silence after the power cut was suffocating. Without the hum of the heater or the occasional creak of the fridge, the house felt disturbingly still. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows and the faint patter of snowflakes against the glass. That I tried not to think about the footprints, or how they stopped so abruptly. It was easier to believe that they'd been left earlier by someone passing through, maybe a neighbor trying to reach the main road before the storm got worse. But deep down, I knew better. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the kitchen. The dim, narrow beam lit up cabinets and countertops, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I rummaged in a drawer for candles and matches, every tiny noise amplified in the silence. As I fumbled to light the first candle, a sound broke through the quiet, a low, rhythmic creaking. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was the sound of footsteps on wood, someone walking slowly across the porch. That I froze, the match burning down dangerously close to my fingers. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Could it be someone lost in the storm, looking for help? But why wouldn't they knock? The creaking stopped just outside the front door. My chest tightened as I strained to listen for any other sound, any clue as to what was happening. Then, something scratched against the wood, a slow, deliberate scrape, like fingernails dragging along the surface. That I stepped back, clutching the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. My heartbeat was deafening in my ears. Hello? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Is someone there? No answer. Just the wind outside and that unnerving scratching that I inched toward the door, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching stopped abruptly as if the person, or thing, outside had heard me coming. I reached the door and hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. Instead, I peered through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, a shadow moved, closer, closer, until I could just make out a figure standing on the porch. They were tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered coat that looked centuries old. Their head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if they were studying the door, or maybe, me. That I stumbled back, my heart hammering as the scratching started again, louder this time. And then they spoke, their voice raspy and distorted. "Let me in." I stood frozen, my back pressed against the wall, heart thundering. "Let me in," the voice rasped again, each word dragging like nails on a chalkboard. The scratching turned into pounding, heavy and relentless. The walls seemed to shudder with every blow. I gripped the knife tighter, unsure of what to do. Then, the pounding stopped. The silence was worse. That I crept back to the peephole, dread coiling in my stomach. The porch was empty, but the footprints remained, fresh and impossibly close to the door. A whisper slipped through the crack in the wood, "You shouldn't have stayed alone." The power surged back, flooding the house with light. I flung the door open, desperate to prove it was just my imagination. The footprints led away, vanishing into the untouched snow, but etched into the frost on the glass was a single word: soon. Part 3. My family's farm had always felt eerie in the winter. The snow blanketed the fields, and the howling wind echoed in the distance, but there was something about the old barn that felt wrong. When the blizzard rolled in, I stayed inside, safe and warm. Until I saw the barn light flicker on. No one was supposed to be out there. Grabbing my coat, I stepped into the storm, the wind cutting through me. As I neared the barn, the light went out. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of dust and hay. In the dim light from my flashlight, I saw a shadow move. But I was alone. I stared at the footprints, trying to make sense of them. They were deep and heavy, as if made by someone trudging through the snow. But where had they gone? No trail led back to the woods. Shadow's growl deepened, his fur bristling as he stood by the door. I grabbed the flashlight and hesitated. Going out there felt like the worst idea, but leaving the mystery unanswered was unbearable. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the cold bit into my skin. The footprints stopped just 5 feet away. Beyond them was nothing but untouched snow, pristine and perfect. "Hello." My voice sounded small, swallowed by the wind. Shadow barked, loud and sharp, his gaze fixed on the tree line. I shone the flashlight in that direction, and my stomach dropped. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just visible between the trees. They didn't move, didn't flinch. It felt like they were watching. That I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me. Shadow whined, pacing near the window. I didn't look outside again, but later that night, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the cabin. The crunching footsteps outside felt like thunder in the silence of the cabin. Each step grew louder, sharper, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside wanted me to know they were there. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as Shadow growled deep in his throat, his eyes fixed on the door. I forced myself to look out the window. The circle of footprints around the cabin had grown. Now, there were several rings, each slightly smaller than the last, closing in toward the house like some eerie spiral. At the edge of the tree line, the figure still stood, its silhouette stark against the pale snow. "Go away." I shouted, My voice trembling, the wind swallowed my words, but the figure seemed to hear. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before gliding closer. Not walking, gliding. The snow beneath it remained undisturbed, as if it wasn't really touching the ground. That I stumbled back from the window, panic clawing at my chest. Shadow barked furiously, pacing in front of the door. Then, the knocking began. It wasn't frantic or angry. It was measured, 3 soft knocks, like a polite guest asking to be let inside. "Let me in," a voice whispered through the wood. It was low, almost kind, but there was something wrong about it. The words didn't sound natural, like they were being forced out of a throat and used to speaking. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy fireplace poker, and backed into the corner of the room. Shadow barked louder, throwing himself against the door, but the knocking continued, steady and patient. When I didn't answer, the voice came again, "Please. I'm so cold." The tone was pleading now, but it only made my fear worse. I didn't respond. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was suffocating. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. And then came a sound that froze my blood. Footsteps, circling the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, each crunch of snow distinct. I tracked the noise as it moved around the house, stopping briefly at each window before continuing. The flashlight in my hand shook so violently I could barely keep the beam steady. Then came the laughter. It started low, almost a chuckle, before rising into a distorted, echoing cackle that didn't sound entirely human. It came from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls, seeping into my ears like a toxin. "Stop!" I screamed, pressing my hands to my ears. Shadow barked and growled at the windows, his body trembling with tension. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I dared to peek out the window again. The figure was gone, but the circle of footprints around the house had grown tighter, the rings now just feet from the porch. And then I saw it, another set of prints, smaller and lighter, appearing in the snow as if being made by an invisible walker. They moved slowly toward the door, one step at a time. I backed away, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The doorknob rattled. Shadow barked wildly, standing between me and the door, his teeth bared. The rattling grew more violent, as if something was trying to tear the door off its hinges. Desperation overtook me. "Leave us alone!" I screamed. Everything stopped, the rattling, the footsteps, even the wind outside. It all fell silent. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the noise had been. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, waiting for the next move. Then, the voice came again, soft and mocking. "You shouldn't have stayed." I turned to the window, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was back, standing inches from the glass, its face still hidden beneath the hood. But now, I could see its hand pressed against the pane, long and pale, the fingers too thin and too many. I stumbled back, and the figure tilted its head, almost as if it were amused. Then it raised a single finger to its lips, as though shushing me, before vanishing into the snowstorm. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat in the corner, clutching the poker, while Shadow stood guard by the door. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, sent my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously stepped outside. The snow was pristine again, with no sign of the footprints or the figure. It was as if the whole thing had been a nightmare, but etched into the frost on the cabin's window, in spindly, jagged letters, was a single word: soon.